So that's where he wanted to similar sort of issues very wide, under the radar. And he's got very, very dark, full length. I don't know if he wants to be first. Do you need the answers?
Not really.
All right.
Well, here we go. Good evening, everybody. First, the public notices. Mobile phones off or on silent. So if I see any of you jigging up and down and giggling, I know you've got your phones on silent. The other one is fire escape. In the event of a fire alarm, there will be a member of the staff here to guide us out, but officially we leave the door here, we turn sharp left and then follow the chain of open doors which will bring us to the outside. So hopefully that won't happen. So good evening, Prime Wardens, Masters, Warden, Liverymen, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Worship Company of Chartered Architects Livery Lecture. And I'm delighted that a quarter of the city's livery companies are represented here tonight. Well, that's me, I'm Stephen Wagstaff, I'm the Master Chartered Architect this year. And the purpose of this evening's presentation is to discuss the city's architectural future by focusing on whether its need for modern state-of-the-art construction is putting its heritage at risk. To help us with this, we have contributions from three distinguished guests, all of whom have considerable experience and interest in this field. We have Peter Luscombe, past Master of the Worship Company of Chartered Architects, past Chairman of the City Conservation Advisory Committee, and current Chairman of the City Heritage Society. He's also appeared on the Antiques Roadshow. We then have Miss... Settle down. Miss Annie Hampson, OBE, just awarded the OBE at the weekend, wasn't it? Annie is the Chief Planning Officer and Development Director for the Department of the Built Environment of the City of London Corporation. And we have our old friend Paul Finch, OBE, Freeman of the Worship Company of Chartered Architects, Editorial Director of the Architecture Review and renowned architectural critic. Paul also chairs the Worship Company of Chartered Architects panel that selects the best new building in the city each year to receive our annual award. And I've said that Paul is a critic, and one year we didn't actually award one. So it's no pushover. Each of our guests will speak for about 15 minutes, and after they have all spoken, there will be a chance for questions. After that, we'll round off the evening with refreshments. We're very grateful that this evening's event is generously supported by J.M. Finn Wealth Managers, who provided the venue, the facilities for the company this evening, together with the drinks and canopies later. So thank you to Finland. Now, I've known London, and particularly the city, for most of my life. My late father was a customs and excise officer in the London docks. In those days, the normal working week included Saturday mornings, and from probably the age of about 6 until my early teens, I spent many Saturday mornings in the docks with Dad. Then, after lunch, we would simply wander around town. Without doubt, my favourite treat was looking at the fabulous ship models in the windows of the various shipping offices in Leadenhall Street. And those of you here who've been privileged to be entertained on the HQS Wellington will know where many of those treasures have now ended up. But despite the joy of seeing those models, I also became acutely aware that just 5 years after the end of World War II, what a battered mess much of the city in particular was in. By this time, I was coming up to town with Dad. Things were not as bad as that. That, I think, was taken just about at the end of the war. But I do remember bomb sites with 5-foot-high brick walls around them, buddleias sprouting up everywhere, and the bizarre sight of cleared areas in the city of London with at the heart of the city with allotment gardens set out in them. Hello, Michael. Sorry. I remember fading air raid shelter signs on the walls, and even old air raid shelters being reused by street vendors, GPO line repairmen and night watchmen. And most particularly, I remember rows of buildings with jagged gaps between them where neighbours had been smashed to oblivion. Many of the city's historic buildings had been lost during World War II, which made one much more aware and fond of the ones and their surroundings that had survived. Seeing them just a few years after the end of World War II made a great impression on my young mind, and I've had to keep an almost proprietorial eye on them ever since. And I think this is probably why I've spent the majority of my 40-year architectural career looking after battered old buildings. The ones that most impressed me were the Tower of London, Tower Bridge, the Monument and St Paul's Cathedral. They represented everything that the city was to me: strong, dominant and eternal, fascinating and big. I like big buildings. Here are a series of pictures that I've taken over the years from the top of the monument. First looking east in 1995, and when we came down off that was a school trip in September 1995, and relevant to a picture you'll see later from one of my colleagues here. We came down off the monument, walked a couple of 100 yards up Upper Thames Street and went to the very first Mithras exhibition in the lovely old coal exchange. What a loss that is. Now, this one was taken in the year 2000, and you'll see that although there has been development, the aspect is still there, and Tower Bridge you can still recognise. Looking the other way, 1955 again, you can see the shell of Bucklersbury House just coming up, and there is the Tower of London. Sorry, Tower, that's not the Tower, is it? Calm down there. The same thing again, taken in 2000, and the Cannon Street building is where our clerk used to live until he became honest and became clerk to the Worship Company of Chartered Architects. But again, St Paul's is still dominating the scene. Come forward again to just 6 weeks ago, and you'll see again the aspects east and west are still feature the Tower, Tower Bridge and St Paul's. And the amazing thing is that the brand new Bloomberg building you can't even see, so it's actually better mannered than Bucklersbury House was. But that's east and west. Look what's been going on north and south. Sadly, I couldn't find the pictures I took in 1955 or 2000 of the views to the north. I love that one. I say nothing. But in the year 2000, As far as I can recall, the only buildings that competed on the skyline with the Gren churches were Barclays, the NatWest Tower as it was then, Kleinworth Benson, the Stock Exchange and Minster Court, with St Michael Cornhill and St Margaret Pattern. And finally, to complete my little bit of today, let me show you this delightful little group of buildings. It's right on the very northern edge of the city. It's in Spittal Yard, and it is the headquarters office of the Architectural Heritage Fund for the UK. The City of London blue plaque on it tells you that on the 20th of January 1669, Susanna Annesley, the mother of John and Charles Wesley, were born lovely. But walk back down Spittal Yard into Spittal Square and look back. Look at that. Very cheap point, I'm sorry, but I had to make it. I'm not saying that what I've observed happen to the city in the last 50 years is wrong, and I'm not saying it's right. In that time, the square mile has changed from the shop window for successful enterprise that's been conducted elsewhere in this country or across the world, and it is now the place where the money is actually made. It's in direct competition with financial, insurance and other service markets around the globe, and in that role, to retain its supremacy, it has to move with the times. This inevitably puts pressure on the old to justify its survival alongside the new. I'm sure that no one wants deliberately to destroy their heritage or to live in a museum, but difficult decisions have to be made, and that's the reason behind the title for this presentation: Heritage and Modernity, War or Peace. So now let's move to the first of our contributors, Peter Luskin. Peter.
The strife is o'er, the battle done, now is the victor's triumph won. Oh, let the song of praise be sung, Alleluia. I get the impression that that is how many people greet the designation of their patch as a conservation area. We are safe. No one can come along and alter the area now. The strife is o'er, the battle won. Of course it isn't. As I see it, the establishment of a conservation area merely defines the battlefield. So what are conservation areas? The right to designate them was given originally by the Civic Amenities Act 1967, now superseded by the catchily entitled Planning brackets Listed Building and Conservation Areas closed brackets Act 1990. Neither says that no changes can be made. A conservation area is defined as an area the character or appearance of which it is desirable to preserve or enhance. So not just preserve, and the opportunity to enhance is the opening for change. But who decides if a planning application is an enhancement or at least not detrimental to the conservation area in question? Most conservation areas will have been designated by local authorities, and planning applications go to the same authorities, so they are the ones which decide, with the advice of course of their planning officers, whether a proposal is detrimental or not. Can the public have a say in this? Yes, they can. Anyone is entitled to make representations about any planning application, not just those in conservation areas. So how do people know that an application to do something is being made? Neighbouring owners can be informed by the local authority, though this is discretionary. Otherwise, the most obvious way of seeing one of these is one of those, or something very similar, sellotaped to a gatepost or a lamppost near you. This is the version that you see in the city. They both give a specified time to make your comments or objections. If it's in your street and someone is proposing to erect a 30-storey block of flats next to your bungalow, you may well be inspired to make a comment. There are also many amenity societies, civic societies and conservation area advisory groups who keep an eye on any proposals and take it upon themselves to comment. Where I live, it's the Wanstead Society. These bodies may also be informed of applications by the local authorities, or they have to do their own research. They will almost certainly have to find their own meeting places, and they are not likely to be given much help by the planning officers. There is a danger that individuals or groups don't always know what it is reasonable to object to. I recall an occasion while sitting in a planning office waiting to see a planning officer when some ladies were poring over a planning application and one remarked, "I can't see why she wants a third bedroom. They've got only the two of them." I was at a seminar organised by the London Forum of Amenity and Societies last month to discuss Sadiq Khan's proposed plan for London, and the delegates constantly brought specific problems to the attention of the GLA team, which of course they could not address. One chap pointed out that the proposal for increased density of housing in areas within 800-metre radius of a tube or rail station or town centre boundary meant that, due to the profusion of such stations in London, practically the whole of his borough would fall within the definition, and that Sadiq Khan had declared war on the suburbs. No doubt he will be called a NIMBY, and not in my backyarder. But that derisory appellation, whether deserved or not, does indicate a truth. Most protesters or conservation bodies are made up of people who live in the area and are concerned how their backyard is treated. Which brings me to the city. The city has few residents, the Barbican being the big exception, and I'm told that the Barbican residents do make comments on anything they think adversely affects their estate. But who else walking through a city street stops to read one of those planning notices, or, if they do, thinks it any of their business to look at the application and comment? So, who does look at the planning applications in the city conservation areas, other than the planning officers? Well, there is the City Conservation Area Advisory Committee, the CAAC for short, which was set up by the city itself to scrutinise applications in 1973. Without its hard work, it's hard to see who would take an interest. The CAAC is different in many ways from the other groups that I've mentioned elsewhere in the country, and not just in having been set up by the local authority. It meets regularly every 3 weeks in a committee room provided by the corporation, has a small budget to employ a secretarial help, convening meetings and minuting them, and has presentation by 2 planning officers of every planning application affecting the exterior appearance of any building in any of the 26 conservation areas of the city. And it's provided with tea and coffee, except in August. The composition of the Conservation Area Advisory Committee is pretty unusual too. All the ward clubs are invited to send representatives, also the City Property Association, the RICS, the Urban Design Group, the City of London Historical Society, the Georgian Group, the 20th Century Society, the Victorian Society, the City Heritage Society, and the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, the most recent addition. A member of the Planning Committee may sit in on some of these sessions to observe. The photo has no relevance except to show there were 15 members there, but I'm told every lecture should have a little light relief. As you may imagine, there are occasions when we do not get unanimous agreement. I recall one delightful incident when the this building came up for conversion to a hotel. No sooner had the planning officer finished his presentation, and before the chairman could get a word in, the late but wonderfully named Humphrey Crum Ewing, the Victorian Society representative at that time, demanded, "What I want to know is why this hasn't been referred to the Victorian Society." And the voice from the other end of the table replied, "It's been to the 20th Century Society," to which the enraged Humphrey retorted, "The Victorian Society's mandate runs till 1914, and it should have come to us for comment." In fact, the PLA building was started in 1912 and not completed till 1922, so it's a very fine appointment. Do we, the CAAC, I've been a member now for I think some 14 years, make a difference? Well, less than 10% of all planning applications actually go to the planning committee. All the rest are decided by the planning officer under delegated powers. So most applications in conservation areas are only looked at by the CAAC and the planning officers. And I think we do influence decisions, especially the small but important matters of shop fronts, signage, AC plant, additional stories and so on. We are, however, only an advisory committee, and over the major schemes we do not always get our way, and I must say that some of our failures I regret. An example is New Court in St Swithin's Lane, the offices of Rothschilds. Never mind what one thinks about the design of the building as a whole, it's its feature called a sky pavilion, which breaks the height guidelines for the area, and which pavilion contains a stack of double height event rooms that we find so objectionable. The project was completed in 2011, but it still rankles. When it came before the CAAC at the planning stage, we protested that this sky pavilion would rear up behind the tower and spire of St Stephen Walbrook, a Wren church, though the tower and spire are later. The tower and spire could at time be seen silhouetted against the sky, but only from Bucklersbury. The project was built, but we were right. It's hard to understand how consent was given which so badly affects such an important building in a conservation area, and a consent that breached the height guidelines laid down by the authority giving consent. Needless to say, there are numerous other projects completed or in the pipeline that we did or do object to. The struggle to maintain the integrity of conservation areas is, however, ongoing, and new challenges arise all the time. A recent trend which is exercising us at present is from a new direction. Some of the 80s postmodern buildings, which are now deeply unfashionable, but which were carefully detailed to sit well with their neighbours, are now not being torn down and redeveloped, but stripped back to their framework and reclad. This recladding is in the latest fashion for story-height windows with strips of stone between them, which changes the scale of the buildings to the detriment of their neighbours. We also face what I can only call the dumbing down of architecture. Unfortunately, it's difficult for me to illustrate this. As not being aware that I was going to be asked to contribute this lecture, I have no photographs of before and after results of this latest threat. However, I do have some which may give you an idea of what concerns us. This is 20 Old Bailey. A bit hefty, but full of character, executed in good materials. But this is the rear elevation, and this a detail, and this the side. So you would expect the front to be something, quite something. Well, it was. Described by Pevsner as self-aggrandizing, it has been scraped off and replaced by this. Give me self-aggrandizing any day. Then there is Procession House on Ludgate Hill, a very quirky building, but all of a piece, and in this photo, very considerate of its former former City Bank by Calcutta. The proposals are to infill the balcony and remove the freestanding mullions and transoms which currently break down the scale of the later building and which blend so well with the Calcutta neighbour. I just walk up to it. We're going to take out these and fill in that, totally changing the scale of it compared to its neighbour, which had been so carefully considered before. At the other end of the building, we have a rather extraordinary facade as part of Ludgate Circus. The proposal here is to scrape it much as the Old Bailey scheme, and similarly to the Old Bailey scheme, to replace it with a bland facade of Portland stone with holes punched in it. Other proposed alterations also serve to reduce a characterful building to mediocrity. These are schemes in conservation areas, but even now the whole city is not a conservation area. And one of the debates that the CAAC has every now and again is that schemes not actually in conservation areas frequently have an impact on the conservation areas by rearing up behind them and overshadowing them and their neighbours, and of a totally different scale. And these do not come before the committee. The terms of reference to the committee, however, relate only to conservation areas. And it's been pointed out that it is not really practical to expect the planning officers to assess the impact of buildings outside the conservation area and decide which to present to the committee for comment, even if the remit of the committee was not restricted to conservation areas. What the committee agreed was that if a member had a particular concern about a proposal not in a conservation area, the member should bring it to the attention of the members, and it was up to them to pursue it or not as individuals. This brings me to the City Heritage Society, of which I am currently chairman. It tries to review all planning applications in the city and comment on them direct to the city. It also has representation on the CAAC, so if an application arises that it thinks is of concern, it can be drawn to the attention of CAAC members. Of course, this is not the only function of the Society. It was founded at the instigation of Douglas Woodward, a Common Councillor at the time and serving on the Planning Committee, who was concerned about the lack of consideration being given to conservation areas in the city. The Society was a direct response to the creation of the Conservation Area Advisory Committee in 1973, as, when the committee was proposed, Douglas suggested that as well as representatives of the ward clubs, there should be representation of the residents of the city. This was agreed, and he got the Barbican Residents Association, where he lived, to set up the Barbican Association Conservation Group, which was given a seat on the CAAC. Soon, however, the group had members from outside the Barbican, so it was rechristened the City Heritage Society, and it was recognised as the Amenity Society for the City of London and achieved charitable status. Its other main contribution to conservation is the sponsoring jointly with the Worshipful Company of Painter-Stainers the City Heritage Award. This award was presented first in 1978 and is for the best refurbishment stroke conservation projects completed in the previous year. The most recent one is the Worshipful Company of Salters Hall for its extension and refurbishment. The intention of the award is to encourage the adaptation and reuse of existing buildings rather than demolition and rebuilding, as well as to reward the repair and maintenance of valuable structures such as the monument. And the award is presented annually by the Lord Mayor. So, back to the beginning, and the title of this lecture, Heritage or Modernity, War or Peace? Well, let's say the struggle continues, so my message is this. Be vigilant, because your adversary, the developer, as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking what he may destroy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I was tasked with doing a short talk about the corporation's views on the character of the city and its conservation policy. As those that know the city well, that is actually quite difficult, because the city's approach to its historic character and conservation has to be said to be as varied as the people that make up the city, both as elected members and officers within the corporation with their different roles, and those that work, live and visit the city. It cannot be taken for granted that the significance of the city's heritage is universally embraced, and it is important that its champions remain vigilant and involved. The Conservation Area Advisory Committee and the other heritage bodies that contribute play a key role in safeguarding this heritage, and as city officers, we value that input. We very often host visiting teams from across the world involved in development, many of whom now very significantly regret the loss of the historic core from their various city hearts. For most of the city's 2,000-year history, for most of us, the city's 2,000-year history is key to its sense of place, its DNA, and plays a vital role in its uniqueness, attractiveness, and also its future. It speaks, as has been said, of its maritime and trading heritage and unique relationship with the Crown. And yet it is those very same drivers for change which are key to that character and a potential threat to its historic fabric. As local planning authority, the city has special responsibilities supported by law, supported by government and other guidance and its own policies, which require us to safeguard the city's built heritage, the city's archaeology, and also special views of St Paul's and the monument from within the city. Also key river prospects and also designated panoramic views of those monuments from across London. On our vital statistics, the city has over 600 listed buildings, over 80 of which are Grade 1 listed, making them in the top 3% of importance. These vary from things like St Paul's, which I must say is one of the things that gets me up in the morning, the Wren churches, the Bank of England, to bollards and telephone boxes, which is a particular favourite of our current chairman of Planning Committee. They cover buildings of every period and include 20th century buildings such as the Barbican, the Salters Hall, which has just been referred to, and Lutyens Midland Bank, which is now converted to the Ned. This slide, which is probably quite difficult for you to see, shows the distribution of listed buildings across the city. The pink ones are the Grade 1 listed buildings, the blue Grade 2 star, and green the concentration of Grade 2 listed buildings. And as you can see, those are scattered right across the city and are very different in nature. The city has a third of Greater London's scheduled ancient monuments with important Roman remains, and I am particularly pleased with the Temple of Mithras exhibition area in the new Bloomberg headquarters, which again has been referred to, for which we required this to be secured through the planning process and also public access to it. And this was very well supported by Bloomberg themselves, who very much embraced this. Already over 50,000 people have visited that, which shows the level of interest that there is. Again, as been said, the city has 26 conservation areas at present, which cover 38% of the city. And current discussions are being held on whether to include the Barbican and Golden Lane estates, and that consultation period is just completing and will get reported back to committee. The conservation areas are hugely diverse in character, from places like the legal precincts of the temples, the lanes and alleys south of St Paul's, the heart of the empire of the Bank conservation area, and the other routes of Lovett Lane down to the river and Billingsgate, which again have already been referred to. The city's success in delivering a large and thriving world financial and business centre and the resultant pressure for growth has led to inevitable tensions at times between the historic fabric and the challenge of delivering the floor space required, and that tension will continue and I suspect will exist always. This slide shows, in fact, the other constraints across the city which have actually secured those views that have been referred to. That there are St Paul's Heights, which came as early as the 20s to protect views of St Paul's, also river prospects, which are in the London plan, and then the larger panoramic views, and then those views from the monument, which again were referred to, which secures the views from the monument to the river and to the tower and to Belfast. It is also essential that the city's historic buildings play an active part in the future city, and that they are not just preserved in aspect, except in the rarest of cases where that is necessary, and are adapted and made suitable for future uses. When I first joined the city in the late 80s and 90s, there were two significant issues for the historic city. A requirement for large dealing floors with the deregulated banks was a particular threat to the buildings and street patterns due to the difficulty of fitting these enormous floor plates into historic plots. There was one case where this was successfully resolved in Merrill Lynch's headquarters, where historic fabric, including this frontage to Newgate, was maintained, also parts of the wall, although we did lose the sorting office in order to secure that. But it remains one of the most successful schemes of this era. The other was what to do with the larger and often redundant banking halls. And it is now surprising they were seriously under threat. There was a view that virtually the whole of Cornhill should be demolished and rebuilt. But these have largely been retained and now provide the bars and restaurants that support the business, the city's wider function. This is the Ned, and this was the old Midland Bank headquarters, and this has been converted, as many of you are aware, to a very successful hotel, and safeguarded much of the original banking hall and converted to restaurants. This actually, I was supplied, probably those of you who really know, this is actually an Ely Place, which is not in the city, but it's a favourite drinking hole of city planners. So I rather suspect that's how it ended up here, but it's the broad message that these sort of historic pubs provide the sort of backup space that support the business city. And things like Bow Lane, Leadenhall Market, and also markets that we are using in to create a sense of space around the Guildhall. The new hotels have also been referred to, both at the PLA. There's also a boutique hotel in Threadneedle Street, and also the Ned, which is finding uses for the city's historic buildings. It's also quite difficult to gauge the degree to which occupiers in the city refer to the character of the city as being important to them. And we are trying to do some research along with Historic England in order to try and measure that. But often people do very much talk about the city as being full of character and an important part of what contributes to them. I do believe the city is a livelier, more vibrant place than it was. I'm sometimes encouraged by a son who is at the City of London Boys' School, who does say, "Mum, the city is a jolly sight better than it was." So I'm quite grateful for that. But we do have to develop. One of the huge pluses, again, of the changing occupiers in the city, that many of them are small and medium enterprises, and they are very attracted to some of the quirkier sort of spaces that are created in the city, where there is less reliance and need for major, large, clear office floors. And this is again just examples of where life is being changed. One of the things again that I am very pleased about is the Royal Exchange. While not everything about it is perfect, getting public access into that building was again one of the things that I was very pleased that we achieved. In order to deliver some of this growth, it has been necessary to find locations for it. And the city has concentrated its greatest growth in the city cluster, where it impacts least on the key views that we've spoken on and on conservation area. And in doing so has created a juxtaposition between new and old buildings, which is now part of the city's character and has produced some exceptional late 20th and 21st century buildings, which will in some cases create the city's heritage of the future. And again, there is a lot of interest, and you will see people wandering the eastern part of the city looking at both new and old buildings. Many of the city's institutions and worship spaces occupy some of the most exceptional buildings in the city, and these also are a significant part of city life, in addition to its role as a world financial centre. The appetite for the city's heritage is enormous, and the open day held every year in September attracts a huge number of people. We would, as local planning authority, encourage as much public access as possible into these exceptional spaces, and we do try to secure as many of those in our negotiations on new schemes. So to conclude, I would like to persuade you that we do care very much about the city's historic environment, and that it is for me inspirational for the work that we do. However, the pressure for change and to provide new floor space is intense. Silence by some can too easily be interpreted by those it suits as a lack of interest. It is essential that those with an interest engage in the process to ensure the robustness of the historic city. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I feel a bit like Daniel in the lion's den because we've heard of the threats to the city. We've seen examples of some quite horrible buildings, and we've seen examples of scale which some people find unacceptable. How could somebody stand here and argue in this company, of all companies, that actually modernity can outgun heritage, that actually history shouldn't always be the determinant of everything we do in the future? And I think the title of this evening's event, this phrase, War or Peace, well, I think it's a sort of armed truce that you often get between conservation groups and people who want to build. There is nothing new about this. And let me say this, everything was new once. You know, people are now sentimentalising about the Barbican, should it be a conservation area? Do you know when the Barbican was built, there was outrage about the Barbican and what it represented. Why does the City of London need this sort of brutalism, this imposition on its medieval street plans and so on and so forth? You know, the city was outraged when Bankside Power Station was built across the river at the end of the 1940s. A horrible one-fingered salute from a Labour government to the city of wealth and finance across the river. What happens 50 years later? You know, you couldn't demolish Bankside Power Station if you tried. You know, and some people did try, but there was absolutely no possibility of doing it. Do you know, if you go on the public gallery of what is now Tate Modern, you get wonderful, unexpected, and when the building was completed, absolutely new views of the Dome of St Paul's. Wonderful, longitudinal Wren masterpiece. By the way, Wren died in despair and disgrace, extremely unpopular, and the populace hated his design so much that they put hoardings all around it so nobody could see it until it was too late to do anything about it. Everything was new once and everything was controversial once. Anyway, from a platform over at Bankside, you get this fantastic view. There's only one little problemette, that if you stand sort of here, it appears that one of the Barbican towers, now protected by Historic England, appears to be growing directly out of the Dome of St Paul's. However, if you move 12 feet the other way, you can get clear blue sky between the two of them. It is just a fact of geometry that everything has a relationship to everything. And if you want to be offended by views of St Paul's that are being interfered with, all you have to do is to get a bit of string and an A to Z map, put a pin in St Paul's, run the string round the map and find somewhere that you can go and say, isn't that shocking? Because I can see another building directly in line with that dome, One America Square, for example. But as you've heard, actually St Paul's has got more protection, so there's more protected views and a near obsession with conservation and not interfering with history in London, and the City of London and the City of Westminster in particular, than almost anywhere else on earth. And I think you have to ask yourself at a certain moment, why are we so frightened? Why are we frightened of technology? Why are we frightened of modernity? Why are we frightened by the fact that the city is no longer the city of furriers and the exchange and trade of goods and physical things? It's the exchange of knowledge, it's flows of intellectual activity. And that new condition, as with all other new conditions, requires new architecture. And you cannot put computer suites into Gothic buildings without enormous difficulty. And the reason that the city now looks different to what it did before is because it's functioning differently. And the reason that we don't have airports with thatched roofs, as it were, is that it doesn't make any sense. New uses, new conditions, new architecture. And that's why, for example, probably in a minority of 2 or 3, I like the walkie-talkie. Do you know what I like about it? The City of London had the wisdom to insist that a new public room at the top of a tall building in the city should be provided as a condition of planning. It's a wonderful new free space, and that has triggered a whole policy in the city, which Eric Parry's super tall skyscraper is going to have a public room at the top. It's a new idea that the public should have access to the top of buildings in the new city that we're creating. The new city has a new condition. The new condition is one of height and scale, and the architectural response is to try to incorporate public space and public facilities at height rather than as we've done traditionally on the ground. Yes, we all love Bloomberg, and it just goes to show that you don't have to build high necessarily, either to get density or to get modern working conditions. But let's say I think Bloomberg's the exception that proves the rule. This is a bespoke, customised, magnificent HQ, and we all applaud the Mithras thing. But that is not the condition in which most city office workers can possibly operate in with their financial services. They're not working for a media mogul who said to Norman Foster, I don't care what it costs, I just want it to be right. That's fine for Mr. Bloomberg, but it ain't going to cut it with anyone else in the city at all. I may say at the opening, Bloomberg, just as an aside, made a very funny remark, because he said that he felt that he was a billionaire who wanted to be an architect. And then he looked at Norman Foster and said, "You're an architect who wants to be a billionaire." I may say Norman did not smile. But I suppose that was proof positive that you can have modernity. It's very new, a lot of new technology in that building in a historic context. Now, I like the fact that conservation is an anagram of conversation. And my proposition is that actually good new architecture will always have that sort of conversation with good new architecture from the past. And I completely dispute the idea that the Rothschilds building is actually ruining St Stephen Walbrook. I believe it has a far more profound relationship to St Mary Woolnoth, and I think the relationship works. It doesn't worry me that the City of London has jump scale. Do you know why? Because it makes it unique. There are very, very few major cities in the world where you can get this combination of seriously old and seriously new, and the inevitable jump scale that results. And I find it refreshing, let's say, to walk up Love Lane and suddenly you get something brand new and tall juxtaposed with something possibly medieval or Georgian. By the way, how impertinent of Victorian society to lay claim to buildings that didn't finish till 1920. I mean, these people are unbelievable, and they think that the whole of London is being run for their benefit. Well, I've got news for them. No, it ain't. It's being run for the benefit of the economy. And between the mid-70s and mid-80s, and you can correct me on the exact dates, but the City of London actually replaced about a third of its entire building stock. Now, the bravery and foresight in doing that is something I think we're in severe danger of losing. We mustn't be frightened about the new, and we mustn't be frightened about taking on the challenges that modernity and technology will impose on us. Not to mention the housing issue, but that's for another evening. Can I remind you that the argument about old and new was most extreme in London in the Battle of the Stars in the 19th century. And it was almost a war between you know, the Ruskinians, the Goths, and the classicists. But just to prove that peace can break out, we have the wonderful example of the Palace of Westminster, where Charles Barry, with his magnificent classical plan, which, by the way, is in fact an exposition of the British Constitution, if you look at what goes where and why, allied to Pugin's kind of frilly Gothic, and it sort of works. Well, we're going to have to spend £4 billion sorting out the asbestos, but architecturally it worked then and it works now. The problem about trying to, why can't we just design things so they fit in? A formula for absolute failure, if ever there was one. You want things that complement. Fitting in usually means pretty third-rate replication. And the problem with trying to replicate historical styles is that you have to be exceptionally skilled at doing it. You have to be have exceptional craftsmen, exceptional performance from teams that largely don't exist in quite that way anymore. It's one thing restoring buildings with skilled craftsmen, you know, work on St Paul's on a continuous basis, for example. It's another thing to do absolutely brand new buildings that have new functions and new requirements. And the idea that you can simply sort of paste on classical elements is a nonsense. So you're always going to have this creative tension, as I think it should be, between heritage and modernity. The speculative office, which most of the images, the shock horror images, are usually of speculative office schemes, you know, too big, too oversexed and over here, it's that sort of thing. But actually, you know, if you look around the world and you ask yourself, why is it that global capitalism likes towers? No one can really tell you why. But the fact is that there's a point at which, if it's working, why argue against it? The reality is that's what corporate tenants seem to want. And the City of London, as a market, has no business in telling these people, actually, we know you want that, but you're not going to have it because Nanny says you should like something better, and actually something that our little group thinks will be more in keeping for you. That is not the way of the City of London. The City of London is a trading, thriving, rambunctious market which responds to what people actually want to do. And the moment it stops doing that, you have a really big problem. Now, just to finish off, I'm going to show you some slides, and they're not from the City of London at all. It's just to show that the world of architecture is the whole world, and it's a wide world, and the world isn't just about speculative office development, and it's not just about history, it's about ideas, elements of joy, and thinking about things in new ways. So just a few things that have won awards at our festival in recent times. So this is Thomas Heatherwick in Singapore, the Nanyang Technical University. No students in the picture. It is an architectural photograph. You rarely get many people, but actually the point about this is this is more like a hub. This is not full of students all the time. The students are all working, many of them from home or other places off campus, and they may come in here at certain times of the day or the week. This is a cultural centre in Wollongong by Woods Bagot in Australia. Is this traditional or is it not? It takes certain kind of ethnic design themes and then uses them for a completely novel building type, an educational institute and cultural centre. Here's Norman Foster in sort of yachting mode, and this is in Monaco, the Yachting Club de Monaco. But the interesting thing about this is the educational facility in the basement, where every Monegasque child is taught to sail free of charge, courtesy of the enormous fees that the yacht club members pay to be a member of it. Dealing with water. This is Konjan Yu from Churenscape in the Anwaiju Wetlands Park in Jinhua City. And this is coping with a very contemporary, the only thing that worries me about London is catastrophic flood. They have plenty of it in China, and these sort of landscape and bridge strategies are there to sort it out. This, believe it or not, is a family house. It's very dense and condensed, and it's rather delightful, and the family that live there love it. It's just, you know, if you looked at that and you say, what the hell is that, if there weren't any people there? Well, you know, you could say, well, it's a start-up business zone or something like that. Well, it isn't. It's a house. This is the most wonderful chapel in El Salvador, and taking that, now that's about as far from St Paul's Cathedral as one could imagine, but in architectural terms, it has beauty, it has spirituality, it has peace and calm and quiet. And a quite different one, this is a chapel in Japan where is for weddings, where the bride and groom start on either side of this spiralling ramp, and then when they meet at the top, they literally and metaphorically tie the knot. Housing in Singapore by Ola Sheeran. He took the idea of Singapore conventional housing towers, and then he just stacked them horizontally instead of vertically. Quite extraordinary. You get some wonderful spaces both between the blocks and at the ground level. A complex idea, but actually I think a bit of a triumph. Nearly there. This is the Grotto Sauna in Ontario. And the thing about this is, it doesn't really matter what it is. The thing about this is the digital cutting techniques, which are doing things with timber, which have not been possible throughout history. And even the most skillful craftsmen can't do this sort of thing because they can't do the curvature. And this gives huge and wonderful opportunities for designers to experiment in new ways. And finally, a moment of intensity. This is actually a transport building. This is the Fulton Center Transport Hub in New York City by Grimshaw. And this is about that 19th century business, the railway and the underground. But the 20th century lighting analysis and the 20th century cutting of the materials and the 20th century approach to how you make new cathedrals for a 21st century community population, to me, are what the City of London has been and should always be about. Intensity, movement, drama, and above all, bravery. Thank you very much.
That worked well, didn't it? So, we have 10 minutes for questions, so can we start? Anybody want to?
Can we make a comment?
Please.
I agree with the Victorian Society thing. Didn't she die in 1901?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I agree with that. I have to say I disagree with you and Rothschild's building, personally, but the rest of it I thought was great. Thank you. Just comment.
Do we have another? Yes.
Do you think that the city missed a great opportunity in not allowing the Mise Banderia building being built in the late 1960s, the new Mansion House Square, which would have then made the complete frontage of the Ned onto a most wonderful square?
And I say that the Lutyens building was designed to be seen on a street frontage, not on a square. And if they had created the square, you would open up the side of the mansion house, which is not of great architectural merit. You've opened up St Stephen Walbrook, which has no architectural merit much on the direct facade, it's only its tower. It was originally built within restricted views, and you can tell that from the stonework. I don't think that anything would have been gained by creating that particular square. And I don't think large open spaces are actually the character of the city. I think the character of the city is streets and street frontages. And I personally dislike the space that's around the bottom of the Gherkin because it's an amorphous shape which doesn't contribute anything, I think, to the street scene.
And Peter.
I would agree with virtually everything that's said there, and it might have been a place for a Lee's Tower, but I don't think that was it. I think what we've safeguarded in some ways is much more interesting than arguing what would have been created.
I mean, it was a fascinating story because I think we can say with the benefit of hindsight the reason that it didn't happen. The city, having said to Peter Palumbo, Peter, if you go and buy the leasehold interest in those buildings, then we will give you a planning permission. Now, it's highly unusual for the City of London to break its word, which is what it did. And I think it did so for this reason. The worry was it wasn't about conservation and it wasn't about architecture. It was a concern that a new square right in the middle of the city would become a target for protesters and anarchists. And it was probably quite far-seeing in view of the Stop the City things that happened. And I think that was never stated, but I believe that was the underlying reason that happened. I think it's not unusual for London squares to be sort of accidental. I mean, if you look at Trafalgar Square, that's not formally a square, it's a mess. And other than the sort of, the kind of Belgravia squares, which are, of course, magnificent, quite frequently in London, it's an accidental condition. And I think there would have been a magnificent formal element to the city, which is why Sir John Somerset, the greatest architectural historian of probably the 20th century, actually, in this country, gave evidence in favour of it, because he said it would be the last chance for 200 years to actually create a square at the heart of the city. However, having said all that, my personal view was that, given what happened subsequently, I'd have far preferred it if the James Stirling option that he'd done for Peter Palumbo, he did an option A and an option B. They built option A, but option B kept the Mappin and Webb building turning the corner. And Stirling was perfectly happy to actually combine his new building and preserve the Mappin and Webb. It would probably have been reused in some other form, but to keep it architecturally. Peter Palumbo loved it. He had the cupola from Mappin and Webb. I saw it when he owned the Farnsworth House in Illinois. He had it in his garden. So there was a great respect for that building, and I think it would have been a more interesting project if it had set out deliberately to really combine new and old in a single building.
The other intriguing thing about the fact that Number One Poultry is now a listed building. I mean, I always think of it as a folly, because it is such a quirky, odd building. But I must say that I would now hate to see it change, because whatever quirky it is, it meets the grain of the city, it has lots of detail. If it was being done today, it would either be something like New Change and bland, or one of these things with multi-storey windows, storey heights, changing the scale. So I think it's settled in very nicely in the city, and while I can't say I think it's a great architecture, I say to call it architectural folly. I think I'm glad it's preserved and it can't be altered.
You see, this is proof positive of the fact that it doesn't take long in Britain for something to become traditional. The Barbican, how dare you touch it? Number One Poultry, what a beauty. I must say this about James Stirling. The building was criticised really harshly by the Prince of Wales, who instead of reminded him of a submarine or a radio set, 30s wireless. And Stirling was asked at a party, after he'd been on the receiving end of these jibes, what he thought about the Prince of Wales. And there was a long pause, and he said, "God save the Queen."
Yes, sir.
I've been an architect for over 50 years. I'm not a traditionalist and I'm not a modernist. I think in the 21st century we have to create architecture to reflect the society, to reflect the new technology, to reflect the way buildings are built. And this is the most important. But in order to create good spaces, the most important thing is to coordinate the modern with the traditional. Not to build traditional, but to have it in spiritually, in way it represents, not the detail, just like the French do it fantastically. Why can't we do it like the French? They have ultra-modern buildings next to old buildings, and the things are spiritually meeting together. And I was last year on the walkie-talkie building, and just to celebrate something, and I was absolutely shocked of the relationship, looking from the height over the spread of the city. I was shocked. Everything was thrown kind of like how one can see. We should request models to see how things marry with each other. The most important thing to stop the war between old and new. We have to create new, but has to be coordinated with what is surrounded. It has to marry and to work together. And I think this is the most important part.
Then again, he would disagree with you on that.
I think technology is going
That's
to
how
come
you do
to,
it.
technology will come to the rescue, because we're already can see computer systems being developed by algorithms and written by games modelers who are modelling cities in a far more comprehensive and sophisticated way than ever before. And I think if we can't do it right now, in the very near future, we'll be able to model any proposal in any city and see absolutely, without question, precisely what it will look like from everywhere. But your point about the higgledy-piggledy nature of what you can see from height in the City of London, that's what the city's like. That's why the city didn't have a grand plan after the Great Fire, because those individual property ownerships have always been more important in the City of London than the idea of a mass ownership of something who's going to determine a big idea. It's not the city's way. It's never done that. So I think you have to look at the higgledy-piggledy and say, that's what we're like.
I was travelling on the Docklands like Railway quite recently, and there were two ladies talking. One of them said that she just moved to Docklands from the city. And the other woman said to her, do you like it? She said, yes, but I do miss all those lovely little squares and the old buildings.
You're always eavesdropping on ladies' conversations.
But I thought it was a very good point. I mean, you do have this, as you say, what we find, what I find difficult is the particular one with St Stephen Walford, which I just find that dreadful, because there was a tower and spire which had always been seen against the sky, and now it's seen against a curious block. But I do think that we have accepted that these conservation areas are surrounded by and overshadowed by taller buildings, and we're not going to be able to reverse it. But where they come into context, when they come into contact with each other, I think we have to respect scale. I find one of the most distressing things at the moment is that the 1980s postmodern buildings, which were so deeply unfashionable now, but we're all full of little detail and carefully considered things, and their scale, despite their size, was still fairly human. And you take that front off and you put in story height windows, and you take off all suggestion of any sort of cornice or base, and you change the scale so, and it's right against a Victorian building, for instance, and it just makes the Victorian building look like a toy, and that I don't
Tom.
It seems to me that what Paul is saying, we just have to take it and lump it. But what I'm always concerned about is the new building and its relationship to the existing. And it seems to me that, in fact, it just follows what Paul's thesis and philosophy is. It doesn't matter, it doesn't need to have any relationship. And I was most distressed, if that's the right word, when I went to the extension of Tate Modern, and looked from the top floor of Tate Modern across to the city, and I said, my God, I can't think of anything more ugly than the City of London.
No, I disagree with that. Totally disagree with that.
I think
The city's beautiful.
It's much better now, because the city skyline used to be like a set of embarrassing gaggle teeth, didn't it? Now it has focus and it has intensity. It's extremely recognisable. These buildings are very distinctive. They're extremely well built. They're far better than buildings in New York. And I think often what happens with scale, it's a bit like, you know, the Shard replaced. No one can remember what the building was like that it replaced. It was dreadful. No one can really remember, for very good reasons, the building that the Heron Tower replaced. And for my money, the relationship between the Heron Tower and the church across the street is far better than the relationship of the building that it replaced, which is a horrible mid-rise sort of browny colour of absolutely nondescript. And the funny thing is that when you get these extreme, these jump scale relationships, they're far more dynamic, and I say far more respectful. The ones you want to watch out for are the mediocre ones that are trying actually sometimes, oh, well, we can't go too high because we've got to be respectful of the scale. They're not respectful of anything at all. They're usually just not very good. And I think that that's the real dilemma about, it's often the big controversy about new architecture is what the Prince of Wales has always done. He's always attacked people who spiritually actually rather inclined to his view, which is architecture is a difficult game. And you should be supporting your best practitioners. But the Prince picks on all the best ones, and the ones that really cause damage in cities are and clients mostly. It's the middle ground. It's why every provincial city has got a horrible B&Q, anonymous estate right outside the road. That's what kills cities. It's not magnificent towers that are published all over the world. That isn't what kills cities. It's mediocrity and fear.
Can I say about the walkie-talkie? Because I hate that building. When you walk along the street, you don't notice it. There's a big canopy that sticks out and it defines the existing street level. There's one that's now proposed in Fountain Court, which is going to go straight from the back edge of the pavement up for 18 stories, and I think that will be far more destructive of the street scene at street level than the walkie-talkie. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I do, yep.
It's a sort of black thing with sort of curvy bits in it that goes straight up for 18 stories, and you think, surely it should have had some sort of definition in its height, and not just...
Okay, let's have one last question.
I was going to ask Paul, does he actually think that the Gherkin is not tall enough? In fact, that it deserves to be more prominent than it is?
Well, it's a point of view. I mean, and his predecessor of the city, Peter Rees, is always eager to claim some, if not most, of the responsibility of the design for that building. You might remember that the original design for that site by Norman Foster was a building about 3 times the height. And I suppose in view of what's happened subsequently in the city, especially in the cluster, everyone was so shocked at the time. And it was even Peter's and the chair of the development committee saying, well, we couldn't possibly give that permission unless it's completely pre-let because it's so tall. And this was a rare example of the city authorities thinking they were smarter than the property development industry, because actually if somebody with their own risk money is going to do something that someone else thinks is going to fail, I mean, who would you put your money with? You know, L&G, whoever were funding it, and Norman Foster and the developer, would you say they might be better risk takers for a piece of new architecture in the City of London? Or would you think that it's people who work at Guildhall? Because I put my money on the risk takers, just like everybody has to in Britain to make sure that economically we survive at all. I think it's probably about the right height for where it is and all things considered. But I do have sympathy for the view that there's something kind of a bit anemic about the ground plane. It's difficult to put your finger on it. But on the other hand, it is a magnificent icon. And in terms of branding for the city, as well as Swiss Re, the building cost at least twice as much as a first-rate office building would have cost at that time. It was double the construction cost because it was a difficult building. However, Swiss Re did the analysis of what that building had done for their brand and their identity. In the first 6 months of their occupation of the building, the publicity they got, the free publicity, was always Swiss Re, paid for that entire excess of construction costs. And this is the power of branding and architecture and identity. And that's why I think what we should be doing is encouraging our best architects to do their best work in the city. And it's the mediocre ones you want to watch out for.
Well, it always was an absolutely seminal building. I absolutely knew that Navy approved that. It was going to sort of set the pattern. In fact, Norman Foster's building could never have been built because it was on the aviation path. It was 100 metres too high. So 305 is still almost the exact sort of maximum height in the city.
Well, I think you've all been very patient, and I'm sure you're all very thirsty, like I am. But to wind up, point that Paul made about time. I was assistant superintending officer for the Claw Gallery at Tate Britain when it was being built in the 1980s, and Jim Sturley, who had been my hero through college, was, of course, the architect. And when the scheme came out for the #1 poultry, the profession was very divided and quite shocked, and there was I helping to supervise a building going on to a 19th century building built by a sugar magnate, and there was this extraordinary building that my wife insists is modelled on a ship. I don't want a submarine to look at it in the corner. But time moves on, and here we are nearly 30 years later, and it's fine, there it is. And it reminds me of a little thing that I saw when I was at college, first year. We did a college trip, weekend trip to Oxford, and it was just as Churchill College was being completed, and we had a look around that, plus the university proper. And I remember we went into the student union at Churchill College, and some bright spark had drawn a big cartoon and stuck it on the wall, and it was quite a good rendition of the quadrangle of Churchill College, and in the front was a drawing of a notice board on the verge, the grass verge, and it said, "It is traditional that as from tomorrow, students do not walk on the grass." So we get used to things in time. Anyway, Peter, Annie, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been fabulous. Thank you. Make your way out. We have some refreshments for you. So please do.
Last meeting was quite funny. Sometimes I adore storyline. Try to be respectful. Sometimes I feel like saying that. I hope he doesn't think that paper is sometimes like the rescue him from his own version.
When do you go to Friday? Always think New Year's on it's a lovely sunny day.
I live on Churchill Garden.
Oh, very well done. So, yeah.
The best house
And we're also seeing
know about
well, I think it's
Markham space standard set that in 1960. Competition that was set by Westminster for this estate. very iconic. And when this idiot market started said, who needs that? So then you get private sector building houses and new planning and I have new planning. The second bedroom is so small, you just get a bed with a bed.
And of course, because we go over too, because we're only 18 months, we're doing damage as well as in Wales. Oh, you were more after that? Ah. That must have been strange. 18 months is a long time. Yeah, 18 months is a long time. And they went all things were ruined.
Oh yeah, no, yeah.